and common goals, workers within and outside of international firms remain fragmented and dependent. A rather dismal view, but hopefully it's not as dim here in the Midwest, and you will clear up some of my misapprehensions about the future. Yes.
It seems that, we as a country should really be asking some questions about multinational corporations that are based here. I just wondered if you know of any lobbying effort in Washington or any legislation that is on the books to kind of counteract some of the
The
tax shelters,
The AFL-CIO has partially addressed the problem with a bill that they now are trying to promote, and it calls for an established minimum of how many parts should be manufactured in the United States in any car or major appliance that is sold in this country. But it's a very minimal kind of bill. It's not an out-and-out tariff. I've heard union people talking about whether they should promote tariffs, and it does mean a departure from a free trade policy which was pretty well accepted by labor and corporations in the recent past. But I haven't seen very much activity on the part of unions. Yes?
Do you think women of the Northern Hemisphere, particularly the United States, wage earners will have the will and resources to assist women in development in other countries in the form of being willing to pay more for textiles and leather goods and plastics? I see this as significantly affecting our lifestyle if the lot of women who are making the things that we use does improve. And then I have a second question. Has there been any efforts on the part of the ILO, the International Labor Organization, to assist women, or has that been primarily dedicated to men?
In regard to the first one, the first question about willingness to pay for the increase in prices if the labor costs go up, I would imagine that those, so long as there is competition in the prices for products, we don't often think of what is behind the label. The consciousness of the union label that used to be very much a part of the 30s seems to have diminished. There was a campaign by the International Ladies Garment Workers Union in the 60s and early 70s when garment first started going over after the tariff laws were changed in 64. I remember one in particular. It was an American flag, and it said in the bottom, made in Korea. At that time, labor was cheap in Korea. It's gone up too much to have our American flags made there. We have to have them made in the Philippines now. But in regard to the second question, you wanted to know, could you repeat?
Yes, what I'm wondering is, has anyone thought of developing the equivalent of the ILO for
I see.
women workers around the world?
Well, the ILO has done studies. I mean, like the United Nations, of which it is a part, they seem to feel they've solved the problem if they have a conference and publish a lot of very militant papers, and very often the papers end up calling for other conferences and more study. And much of this is very good. It is, especially when it's picked up by a really active organization like unions in the European countries, which are much more tuned into what the ILO is doing, perhaps because it is in their midst. They do publish a continuing journal now on women in development, which has some very good reports. There are not any sustained, but sporadic efforts on the part of women's organizations to establish these networks and maintain assistance groups, you know, in cases. But I've never seen an effective, sustained international action by unions. As yet, unions have not been able to overcome the information gap. When they are engaged in any kind of a negotiation, they often can't even get the basic materials to bring out the legal side of their position. There have been, again, sporadic actions by unions, and some of these acting in response to information they get through the International Labor Organization office, rather, about what gains have been made in the same industry in other parts of the world. Occasionally, workers in a factory in, say, England will refuse to ship parts or produce when a factory in Germany is carrying out a labor negotiation, but none of this has resulted in sustained partnership. So the internationalizing of labor has not kept pace with the internationalization of management, and this is not at all visible in the horizon just now. There's been talk of it, though. Any other questions? Yes.
Is the necessity then to internationalize labor to keep up with management, or is it to bring management back to America in this case, bring the industry back to America?
I think many different approaches might be taken by different interest groups. I do think that the need for an internationalization of labor, at least in an effective information service, so that they can respond to some of the changes which they are only now feeling the impact of. The World Federation of Trade Unions and the Federation of Free Trade Unions have had a rival relationship in the past, but I think that they are trying to overcome this. The rivalry was based on a different political orientation, with the free trade unions having separated from the world trade unions on the score that they were too favorable to the socialized economies. And now, with the general weakness that the European trade community feels, particularly the labor in that sector feels, I think they're more willing to forget some of the political differences and try to reach some accord on basic standards of living. What has happened is that the socialized and communist trade unions have more political leverage within nation states and are less international than even the market-oriented trade unions. And so in a kind of paradoxical situation, what used to be the more international unit based on past history at the turn of the century, that is the communist and socialist parties, tends to be more nationally oriented today. This is the way it's looked at in Europe. And North American trade unions have not joined to any great extent. These are almost limited to the European trade market. Yes?
I thought I get the impression that you were saying that the fact that the first world was becoming deindustrialized and the third world was becoming industrialized made traditional dependency theory and traditional distinctions of the center and the periphery no longer valid. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little more, because it seems to me that despite the industrialization of the third world, their economies are still economies of the periphery. That's still a valid concept, and they are still dependent countries. And two evidences of that being the tremendous debt they've had to go into in order to industrialize, which now makes their economy dependent on institutions such as the IMF, and also their dependence on the first world. If the industrialization is for and export to the first world, they are now dependent on the market conditions of the first world.
I think you make the point well. I think it's up the road ahead, perhaps, that they will lose the importance. They are an important, both dependency theory and unequal exchange are very important in seeing a stage in history, a stage that I envision as passing, as in the process of passing, but not yet passed. There is obviously greater wealth in the United States still, more resources, and we still enjoy a higher level of living. We are not faced with hunger yet. Perhaps some. I have seen some people begging for food in New York City, but let's say it isn't the bulk of people, and it doesn't nearly match the levels of poverty and mortality even, based on that poverty that you see in the third world. But I'm looking into the future and seeing that this model, the opposition of first world and third world, is less important in seeing that transition process. We have to see the sectorial changes that are occurring within nations and also take those into account and make our comparisons on a number of different levels rather than just between nation levels. The dependency has shifted from the US and the rest of the world to international agencies such as the IMF. It's true that the power may still be exercised through the nation states, but it is in response to international corporations which no longer have any particular national base. A General Motors, a General Electric, the large corporations, even Gulf Western, all of the Seven Sisters, in fact, I would say, are not patriots in being U.S. firms. They are international firms, and they are looking to make their investments where the greatest profits can come, not in order to shore up U.S. economy. The objectives have shifted from the 1940s and 1950s investment policies, when they were more clearly able to be labeled as U.S. firms. They are gearing their production to the universal car and the universal robot. They have as many investments in Japan as they do in their own companies, so they don't lose no matter whose car is being bought. And so you don't see the stress towards tariff barriers coming from U.S. industry, because they would be putting barricades up to the flow of goods they control indirectly by investments in other people's companies. It's just a different picture than it was when U.S. industry was a dominant force and could be more clearly labeled as such. I found it, dependency theory, very important in thinking about some of the things that were happening in Bolivia, particularly in the 60s and 70s. I don't know whether it's going to be as useful for the 80s. I'm just trying to envision an emerging model to show the processes. Any other? Yes.
What do you think can be done by the federal government as far as incentives to keep corporations in the United States, to keep their industry and the economy here instead of letting them go off to other countries, and also something to reduce the competition between towns in the United States?
Well, the first thing I think I would do is take away the tax incentives that make the overseas investment more attractive than investment at home. The U.S. government, ever since the early 70s, have in fact, through the tax laws that were made, I guess when Nixon was in, have made it very attractive to have a shelter overseas, either to pass your business through and avoid some of the taxes that you would have in the U.S. So I would take away the subsidizing of overseas industry. I would also revert to some of the earlier tariff laws. Instead of making goods, and this was the big change that occurred in the 60s, instead of making it possible to bring back goods from your overseas plants and pay an import only on value added, a figure which was based only on what the industry itself said was value added, is tariff policy that I think should be reversed to its earlier form. And that would make it less attractive to put manufacturing processes in offshore industries. So just taking away the subsidies to overseas production would be an initial step, and that doesn't even mean that you're going out of your way to protect industry. It's just putting that back. Beyond that, we need and want, then let's tax robots, so they'll be like other workers and have to give over. In taxing robots, that means taking some of the chunk out of the profits that they give over to management and owners. Yes.
If the subsidies were taken away
Mm-hmm.
for American firms overseas, would that then get us caught in the trap that we're in right now? They would have to pull back to the U.S. Their U.S. produced goods would not be competitive with foreign produced goods that get flooded into our market, and we'd get caught in some kind of vicious circle of.
Well, I think it has to be a two-pronged thing, that the organization of labor in other areas of the world has to proceed apace, because otherwise, unless wages rise, you're never going to be able to keep production here. So long as the mobility of capital is as great as it is currently, obviously anybody concerned with profits and a balance sheet is going to produce where it's cheapest. And until labor is organized elsewhere, even with rising transportation costs, it's going to make the differential attractive to investments, and it would require terrible threats or persuasion to keep it at home. In the initial stage of the investment overseas, we did benefit because there was still a lingering retention of control over research and development. We still have that to some extent. And some of the higher professional jobs, that was the stage that Stephen Heimer really analyzed in the late 60s and early 70s. But I think we're past that stage. We're losing some of those advantages, and it's inevitable that research and development will follow the production process itself and become an intrinsic part of the operations in the former third world areas. And we can't hold on to the surface of production unless we have some of the productive base, I don't think. It's not reasonable to think that we can hold on to it forever. I think if some of the attempts by congressmen and senators to refurbish some of the industries and even subsidize workers who have taken over some parts of industry were to go through, that would be an extremely helpful step. If they were subsidized to the extent that some of the large corporations were in many phases of their history, that would certainly not violate any of the premises of free enterprise and still overcome some of the disastrous unemployment rates that we're getting. Any other questions or comments? Well,